Hey everyone, welcome back. So in this video, I just wanted to recap where we're up to so far in the class, and then I'm going to go over what we're going to cover in the following sessions for this week. So we have the Beetle model here. This is our rigged asset here, and I'm just going to go over some of the rig options that we have available to us, and we're going to work and focus on animation this week. So this is all the parts of the rig that I'm going to make available to us when we're actually animating. So I just want to cover those briefly so we're all up to the same kind of point in the class. So we have our rig for the head. We have option to move the head and rotate the horns. We have body and also shell options as well as the root bone. And then we've got the leg IK, so we can move our legs around and rotate those. I expose this bone, which allows us to kind of orientate the foot as well from this point. And then we have the tendril IK, so we can move around our individual tendril parts here as well. And then we also have the wing rig as well. So for this one, I didn't go into bone shapes really for the wing because it's got very specific sort of layout for that. So I wasn't really 100% sure the best way to actually cover that with like simple bone shape, so I just left those as default bones. So that's fine if you want to do that as well. I just wanted to showcase that. So yeah, so that's where we should be in the class. And then in this week, we're going to actually figure out the type of animation we want to create for this beetle and how we're going to approach that. And then we'll start working our way into the different areas of animation within Blender. So looking at the action editor, actually blocking out our animations and using the NLA editor, and actually testing the renders and exporting stuff out. So that will be our week in terms of what we're going to cover. Hey everyone. So when I'm thinking about my animation, I wanted to just cover how I actually come up with my ideas and what references I use before I start actually animating for the project. So just going back to our original PureRef file here, this was when I was originally planning out the project and I was thinking about my presentation. So once I've got to the stage of a more final model where the model is rigged and textured and everything, I can start to think about presentation and I can start to think about how this is going to come together as a final project. So we obviously have our screenshots, which we'll be covering in upcoming weeks in terms of how we do our final presentations there. But I want to just draw your attention here to the animation section. And very early on, I knew I wanted certain types of animation. So I had a couple of different types, which would be one was to sort of roll up into the primitive form or the shape, which was part of my original pitch in the art Bible. So that's something I knew I wanted to cover. I also had this idea of the ecosystem. So I wanted to potentially have an animation that could reveal the ecosystem, and then potentially even a flying animation depending on the complexity of the beetle and everything there. So that sort of was my original pitch, and a lot of that was based on the art Bible, as I said, and my reference gathering, and that's how I kind of worked out my ideas, if you like, just trying to think about how I wanted to present it and the types of animations that I wanted to go for. So now, if I just jump over to Blender briefly, I'm just going to show a couple of the animations that I actually created here. So this one is the one we're going to be working on more for the project this week, which is the flying animation. So you can see the robot kind of moving around and flying here, and then he sort of lands back down. I also have the animation where he kind of reveals up the ecosystem from behind. And then we also have this rolling animation. So he jumps up into his primitive form and then he just rolls around basically. So that's some of the animations that I did for the beetle here. And so I just want to talk about how I grabbed reference for that type of stuff. And the best way, I think, for something like this, when we're looking at animation, because we need to see things that actually move, it's a bit harder than just grabbing images. We can't necessarily do that. So if we were animating a human, then we could record ourselves doing the movement, or we could try and look at references of people moving or that kind of stuff. And I think YouTube is great for that because you can find images and videos of pretty much everything on YouTube. So these are a bunch of videos of the Hercules beetle reference, and there's just a few different videos I wanted to go through. Some of these I found really helpful. So this one is just a really quick video of just the beetle, and I'll just turn the audio down a bit here. have the beetles just moving around, so you get a kind of feeling for how their legs move, and sort of as they're moving around on this person's hand, you can sort of see how they interact with each other. Obviously, in a little bit of a fight there, but yeah, so that's quite interesting. You can see sort of how the tendrils move, the sort of speed of how things are moving as well. That's always really good to get an idea for, especially how the legs are actually moving and bending. There's definitely a lot more kind of flex in the legs than you might expect, so that's pretty cool to see. So that one is definitely a good reference. And then in terms of flying, because we're going to be mostly focusing on flying this week, this one is I'll turn the audio of this down because it's quite loud, but this is a beetle in flight. So it's someone holding the beetle, and then you can see, it gives you a lot of really helpful information. So one of the things you can see from that is how fast the wings actually move, and also how things are vibrating, which is really cool. And then his legs and the sort of position of his legs as he flies. And one of the things you notice with the legs is they come up pretty high. It's an interesting kind of thing. They raise their legs up quite high when they actually end up sort of flying, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. You can also see as he folds away his wings, they stay outside of the shell for a little while, and then he kind of tucks them back in again, which is also kind of interesting. So there's a lot of good information just in that particular video as well. So you just sort of see how he flies and how he moves and walks and things like that. And then this one is a more in-depth look at beetles in general, and I think it's based around beetle robots. So this initial one is a beetle kind of landing and coming in, and again you can see the same information about the flight. This one is great because you can also see him take off. And one of the things I find helpful with YouTube in general is that you can, in the settings, just change the playback speed. So if you want to look at this in slow motion, just change the playback speed and you'll be able to see, as this is playing out, what happens in his takeoff, right? So you can see he kind of moving his legs around and the body is moving and everything. And then as he starts to open up his wings, you can see the position there of the shell, like what happens to the shell, how it rotates, and its orientation. And then as his wings come out, and then his body sort of rises up, and then he kind of takes off. So you can see some good kind of poses that he does along that line of actually taking flight. And then if we kind of come forward a little bit more, this is a video I already showed about the wings actually rotating out. And then this one, I think this is actually already at sort of full speed. If we go back to original playback speed, this is already in slow motion. And this is a really helpful video of, I think these ones are actually more robotic beetles because it looks like it's attached to a wire, which is kind of interesting. But again, this is really interesting because you can see that the actual shell parts vibrate. So you can see here, this is what the wings do. They have some flex to them. I actually think this one might be a real beetle, potentially. And then this is the robotic one that they're creating by the looks of it there. So yeah, this is the real beetle. And you can see the flex in the wings, like as the wings are flapping, like the flex you get. And then also the way the shell is sort of vibrating from the movement of the wings. So those are all things that I picked up from these videos. And that's really helpful when it comes to animation, because you've got to think about how these things are moving. And then when you actually keyframe the animation, you want to put some of those ideas across in the actual animation itself. So that's sort of the way I was going with it. And you know, I'm definitely not an animator, so that's not my job role. My job role is environment artist, so I'm still learning about animation myself. But these are some of the things that I just picked up as more of a beginner in animation. But I think the result and everything and the tools, I can definitely teach the process of how I actually animated those final results and everything. So just wanted to cover some of the theory though, in terms of how I actually went through that workflow of like looking at reference and figuring out how I was going to approach my animations when it came to that type of stuff. So hopefully that's useful. Hey everyone. So here we are back in Blender. I wanted to start off with our animation by just covering some of the basics of the different editors that you get as you jump over into the animation window. So if you tab over to this area, This is the view you'll be greeted with. And so in Blender, we have a few different editors for actually dealing with animation. So if you click this little drop down, you'll see that we have the dope sheet, the timeline, the graph editor, drivers, nonlinear animation. So if you're a beginner and someone approaching animation for the first time, this can definitely be a bit overwhelming. So I want to just briefly cover what each of these things do and how they can be useful in your workflow. So the first thing to just get your head around is the dope sheet is what we're actually in now. And when you're in the dope sheet, you have the option to come into the action editor. So effectively, the dope sheet and the action editor are kind of similar. With the dope sheet, you are effectively controlling your keyframes and being able to edit your position of things. With the action editor, we're actually building out small little actions that can be repeatable animations. So a really good example of something like that would be, we want to have the wings flap, and so we could just make a small animation of it doing one singular wing flap and then kind of repeat that animation. So that's what we might use the action editor for. The action editor is also used for poses. So we will cover the action editor and how we're actually going to use that as we move forward in this particular video. But I just wanted to mention that. So that's dope sheet and an action editor. The timeline will just display the timeline, so you can just play out your animation. So you see that already kind of being here on the bottom when you're in the view mode. So depending on which view mode you're in, sometimes you'll see the timeline. So if you're in, say, the modeling, you don't see that, but certain view modes you jump into, you'll see the timeline on the bottom there anyway. And then we have the graph editor. So graph editor is if we want to edit how our keyframes are actually working, so we can change the interpolation between them. So if they were, say, linear keyframes or Bezier, we can edit the graph and the keyframes themselves. I won't be probably doing too much of that, but we can definitely jump into there occasionally if we need to. And then drivers are a separate thing in Blender where effectively we can use drivers to control one particular area. So you can change anything in Blender to be a driver. So for example, if we wanted to, say, have a control to rotate the horn, we could actually build out, like, say, jump into object mode here. An example of a driver would be, let's say we had this box. We could translate the box to the, like, in the Y direction, and it would rotate the horn. And that would be done using a driver. So basically, you would drive the rotation of the horn based on the location of the box. So that would be an example of a driver. That can be very helpful when it comes to animation, because sometimes you want to have a simple thing happen, such as moving a box, and it change something quite dramatically. So you can even use drivers to drive things like animations as well. So, like, for example, if you wanted to move this box and have the back of the shell and the wings all open up and expand, you could definitely do that. You could do that drivers on bones as well, so it doesn't just have to be on simple boxes or whatever. You can do it on lots of stuff. So drivers can be super powerful. And then the nonlinear animation, this guy is a bit confusing, but essentially you can use it to stack up actions. So you can see that here I've got these different layers of actions going on, and I can have multiple animations playing out and then blending together and things like that. So we will get into that as well, because once we do the flying animation, we're going to build up a small collection of smaller animations and then enable those to actually create our final animation, as you can see here. So we've got flapping wings and those types of things. So we will cover all of that stuff in the actions, and then we'll actually build that out into our nonlinear action editor. So yeah, it's a little confusing, but most of the work we're going to be doing is within the dope sheet, within the action editor. So we'll be doing small animations in here. And then when we're kind of done with that, we'll be jumping over to our nonlinear animation. So in terms of the setup for this, you can have whatever you want here, whatever you find easier. In some cases, I have split this out. So I would split this into another version here and then have the nonlinear action editor, so I can animate in my actions here and then see the actions come through here. And then we have the graph editor if we want to edit things more specifically. Or alternatively, if you just want to work in one area, you can just collapse down some of these and just work with the action editor. and then you can split it out. So you have some flexibility in the way that you lay this out. So I just wanted to cover that as well. So now we understand a little bit about how the action editors and the animation editor windows work inside of Blender. I wanted to cover how we're actually going to create our first poses. And this is going to form the basis of how we do our animations as well, because we can use our poses to blend between different states of the model to create the animations, and we can also use those poses when we come to presentation as well to help actually manipulate the beetle into the position that we want to actually use for the screenshots. So that's how we're going to use the poses. So the first step is just make sure you have the pose library enabled here. So you just come to add-ons and search for pose to make sure you have this guy enabled. And then in terms of actually posing this, I want to just show a couple of examples before we actually create our poses here. So we'll just split this out. And I'm going to switch this to the asset browser, and then I'll switch it to the current file. So these are a bunch of poses that I already created for the rig. You can see them here in the asset browser. So poses now live inside of Blender within the asset browser as an asset. So if we've got our rig selected here, we can jump over into pose mode, and you can see everything is defaulted at the moment. But I have these different poses for opening up the wings and changing the way that this looks. So if I click this guy, double click it, it's going to apply this pose, which is the open wings. I can also apply this one, for example, where we open up the wings themselves, as well as the shell. And then we can actually collapse down the wings. So we have a few different controls there for some simple basic poses. In terms of if you're in a pose or you've manipulated your animation in some way and you want to get back to the default, just select all the bones and hit Alt. And then when you hit Alt, you can hit R, S, and G. And this will basically reset all of the transforms, the scales, and everything there. So that's kind of how we're going to work with setting up our poses. So the first step here is to jump over into the animation tab where we can actually see our objects. We've got our asset browser on the right hand side here. If we click to unassign, this basically will be, as we create assets, it's going to come into this category, and then we can give this folders and things and then assign different areas to the folders as we go. But for now, we'll just stick with the current file where we are, and we can always move it out of that file later as well into more of a hierarchy. But for now, let's just start with our first pose. So I want to just create a simple pose here for the shell actually opening. So I'll just open up the shell by rotating the bones and get this kind of in the position that I want the actual wing to be, or the shell piece to be, as it rotates out, right? So that's the first thing. And then if we wanted to mirror that pose from here to the other shell piece, we can basically, there's shortcuts, but we can right click as well and do copy pose and then select this one and paste flipped. If we paste flipped, you're going to see that this is going to paste the opposite version. So if you're using symmetrical meshes, this can be really good. So that's our, let's say that was our first pose that we wanted to create. We can select the bones that we've impacted, and then we would just hit create pose asset. Now it's going to create some keyframes, and you'll see that it's created Beetle rig here. We can just rename this guy. So to rename this, you want to hit the N panel. Let me just rearrange these windows a little bit here. And we would just rename this. So we could call this pose shell open, for example. And that's going to be our first pose that we've created there. So you can see that there's not a preview here. That's basically done via cameras. So what you would need to do here is, if we jump out into object mode, we can come over to the camera here. And then if we press 0 to jump into the camera, and then in the actual edit here, we just need to come to the view and just do camera to view. And now we can sort of zoom out on this this thing here, and we'll set this to a square render so we can sort of make our preview. And then we just sort of zoom out. We can set the size of the camera in terms of the focal length and everything here. So if we want to sort of zoom in a bit on this, just do that. So this would be the pose that we're creating. And then for creating previews, you can just basically hit this refresh button, and that's going to create the preview there from this. So you can sort of see that there. We could jump into the rendered view. I think if you're in the rendered view with materials, I think this will still capture the shaded view. So if you wanted a custom preview for this with nice values, you'd need to basically render that out, and then you can actually upload a custom preview here. So that's how you build out your previews and everything. It's based on the camera in the scene and the position. We jump back to that. The other thing I also wanted to cover while we're here, let's just jump into this area. So when I keyframe my individual areas of the object, so as we jump over into pose mode, I have keyframes for this particular pose. These keyframes are location, rotation, and scale. You can see that there. That's why they're shaded yellow value. One of the things you can do in Blender is you can default the types of keyframes you're going to capture. So if you go to pose, animation, and where it says change keying set, you can actually choose the types that you want to actually key. So if you only wanted to keyframe location and rotation and you weren't worried about scale, you could just change that up there. So just a note, if in case you wanted to only keyframe one particular key, and the way that you do that is when you keyframe something, if you select an object and you were to move it, if you keyframe it, you're basically going to hit I. So you can see here that when I hit I, it's only keyframing location and rotation, and it's not worrying about scale. So that's just the way I have it set up. But if you want to get access to that, you come to pose, animation, and change keying set. So that's how we work with that. So that's our first pose created. So if we were to reset everything and then we double click that, it's going to jump to that pose. So that's a really simple way of creating poses. You can create as many of those as you want. So for me, like when I was working on this, the ones that I found to be useful, so we can just get rid of that pose. So I had this open up the shell so you could see into the back of it. My default pose, you can actually see the wings are straight. So I have the wings collapsed, which is basically where the wings themselves are deformed to the body. So you can see that I've moved the wings so that they work nicely underneath the shell. And then when the shell is actually closed, they're not sticking through the bottom of that. So that's kind of how that works. We can just reset all of our poses there. And then I found it useful to also have it so that the wings could actually open up. So when they're fully spread out, this is sort of how they look. And I have a pose for that basically. So that's the basic poses. That's some of the ones I found useful when I was posing the Beetle, as well as taking screenshots and animating. Hey everyone. So now we've covered how to actually use the action editor and to set up basic poses. I want to start actually blocking out my animation. So the first thing I just wanted to touch on was there's a free YouTube channel here called Alex on Story. This is a great YouTube channel about how different animations work and the different styles of animation. So I definitely would recommend checking these out. For somebody who's like a bit newer to animation, such as myself as well, I found these really helpful. So you can see that in this example, there's 3 different types of animation. You have pose to pose, straight ahead, and layered. And he covers like a more in-depth look at each of those workflows within these videos. It's like a series of videos that you can check out. And so just to briefly describe each one of them, pose to pose is basically where you block out poses and then kind of blend between them. Straight ahead is working from the start of the animation to the end and making sure you get all the timings and everything correct. And then layered is more where you have a focus on one particular movement and then you add to that movement over time, basically as like a layered approach. So just wanted to briefly cover that. I think the workflow we're more likely to go with is straight ahead. For this particular example, I'm going to start blocking out the animations and everything for the flying animation from start to finish, and then we'll sort of layer up different animations. But yeah, so straight ahead we'll be working from the start of the from the animation and getting the timings and everything correct, and then from there we can obviously add extra flourishes and detail and polish to the animation. So that's my current plan as far as animating is concerned. So here I just want to take a high level look at the animation that we're actually going to be covering and sort of how that can how that's actually going to look when we bring everything together here. So I'm just going to make sure we extend our timeline here to the correct amount of frames. So in terms of the animation, this is just a preview of the animation basically playing out. You can see the Beetle is flying and then he lands back in the same place. And then sort of the animation will cycle. So it sort of repeats, right? So that's the basic animation. And so I use a combination of actions here. So these individual animations here, these are individual actions. So we have the actual animation of the wings opening up. So that's one animation. Then the beetle itself is taking flight. So he's flying up and moving around and his legs are moving and everything. And then we also layered on top of that, we have the actual wing flapping animation as well. So those are the basic actions that we're going to create this animation. And then from there, as we get back to the last part of the animation, we basically play the wings opening up in reverse. So everything will then close back up again. So the wings come back in and then the animation can cycle. So it ends up being in the same place that it started once the animations have finished out there. So just wanted to briefly show that. So we're going to be working on those individual actions and defining that sort of look. So the first thing I want to do here as I start making my first action is I want to actually define the frame rate for the project. So when we first start out, if we click on this output here, we can see that we have a frame rate of 30 FPS. So you have a couple of options when it comes to the frames per second that you choose. I think the default here is 30 FPS. If you wanted to have a smooth animation, you could switch it to 60 FPS, or sort of more traditional cinema style animation generally is at 24 FPS. So you can have some choice there in terms of how this stuff generally tends to look. For my animations, I actually have them at 30 FPS, but you can choose, that obviously has an impact on the way it looks, and it also has an input on the actual output and speed of the animation. So for example, if we rendered at 30 FPS, that's going to be half the speed of double the length of a 60 FPS, for example, right? So because you've got 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second. So it can speed up the animation if you're looking at 60 versus when you're looking at 30. So something to keep in mind. You can scale your animations really easily, so don't worry too much about selecting the right value here, but I'll just leave it at 30 FPS. And for the frame start and end, we can adjust this, but this is the basic total length of your animation. So it's going to start at frame 0 and finish at frame 290. And so if you're going to render out your animation, you have to render out 290 frames for this animation. So something to consider as well. This, for me, when I rendered 290 frames at 30 FPS, it was about 9 seconds long, the animation. So just to give you an idea of that as well. But you can obviously just do the total frames divided by 30, and that will give you the amount of seconds, how long it would actually be the animation. So that gives you an idea, an indication on that side of things. So the first step here is just getting an action actually figured out. So we're over here in the action editor. And as the kind of overall example showed, the first thing I'm going to want to do is basically have my beetle get ready for flight, right? And so I'm going to look at the reference that I have here. This was the reference that I had that I looked at before, and I think this is really nice because it just shows a general feeling of how this beetle actually takes off. And you'll notice like a couple of things I noticed when I looked at this, and some of the things I put into the animation was that firstly, he kind of moves around a bit, like his legs are moving, right? So he's not stationary. You know, you can see that if you look at some of his head bits and everything, there's certain movement to things, the wings are moving, that kind of stuff. It's not, he's never entirely stationary in a lot of places, right? And then what generally tends to happen before he takes flight is his body kind of raises up, right? So you can see this. In fact, let me screenshot this here. So you'll notice he was at an angle straight to the log here, and then what's happened now is his body is kind of arced up as he gets ready to fly. So a couple of things that you kind of can tell about that is his legs. His front legs are obviously very straight. They're obviously pushing him up in that direction. So you end up with this, the bottom of the body faces up towards the sky. So that's something that I noticed he does before he flies. So something I wanted to also think about building into the animation. And then just as he takes off, I'm not worried for this particular part of the animation. I'm not too worried about him actually flying and what's going to happen there. But you can see that before he goes into flight, his wings are going to open up So the shell is coming almost like parallel to the body, so the rotating out to the side, and then his wings will unfold. So that's the first kind of animation or action that I actually want to cover. And then we can start to think about the flight and the other parts of this. So yeah, so that's what I'm focusing on. And so to start with that, the first thing we're going to do is just some basic keyframing here. So we have our objects selected. We can jump into pose mode with Control Tab. And so then I can select the individual bones that we have here. So you can see that I have the body bone selected. I can move these around and everything. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I want to keyframe this body bone to create that look I was mentioning before about this. And just getting the timing right on this is the most important thing. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just press I to put a keyframe in for the body. And so this is our action that we've created. So we'll just create this as we're going to do for the class. So we'll do animation class, so we know what this one is. I've still got some of the other animations in there just in case I need to look at those as reference, but yeah, animation class, and then this is going to be takeoff. So we'll just rename this so we know what's going on here. And then we also have these options here. This one will just basically duplicate the action, or we can press the cross. This isn't going to delete the action. The action will always be there. So if we just remove the action, you'll see that it goes away. We can always reselect that, so we have our class animation. And then the fake user is basically just means that it will essentially, if this isn't used in the scene in any way and it's not referenced, then when Blender closes, this will remove this animation, and this just prevents that. So it's always a good idea just to click that little lock button there. That's essentially something just to safeguard your work. So cool. So that's the first thing. And then what I want to do, I think for this animation, I want to decide maybe this is going to be 60 frames long for this first takeoff animation. We can always adjust this later as well if it's not long enough. But when we hit the space bar, this is going to basically play out the animation, and it will just cycle between that start and end. So that's pretty handy when it comes to figuring stuff out. So maybe at around sort of 20 frames, I'm going to try, I might actually go for 30. So I can move this up and then maybe rotate him so we get that angle. And then we can press I to enter a keyframe. And you can see that that's sort of arcing up, right? Which is pretty cool. And then one of the other things that you can also do here is this little button down the bottom is an auto keyframe. So if you enable this, so if we enable this and then we move our keyframe, say to 15 as an example, and then we were to move this up higher, you'll see that it will automatically enter a keyframe. So you can see that that's sort of giving us like quite an interesting look, but I just wanted to show and demonstrate that auto key there as well. I will often turn that off so I can manually enter keys where I want them, and it doesn't just add lots of keys everywhere. So I prefer to just have a bit more control over it, but it's up to you how you want to use that. So you can see here that the first thing we have in there is our him kind of arcing up, which is cool. And then the next thing I want to do is I also want to open up the shell and open up the wings. So he's going to just take this real simple kind of animation where he opens everything up. So sort of after 30 frames, I might have a little bit of a delay there. We can put in our keyframes and just select both of these and key in the shell. And then we'll just rotate our shell into position here. And so within this, I want the shell to open up, and I also want the wings to open up. So I'm going to allow a bit of space here for those wings once I do the wings, but we'll just open this guy. And then this was actually kind of parallel to the body. In the example, it kind of goes more along the lines of this, right? But I don't really want to do that. I want the shell to still feel like it makes sense and functions with the hard surface design. So I probably will just have him rotate a little bit there. So that should be pretty good. And it's you'll see that depending on the rotation as well, that we have a little bit of space for this to actually, it kind of ends up clipping, right? So what we can also do to prevent that is maybe just move this guy a little bit. If he's locked, we can always just unlock him and just maybe move the shell so it doesn't clip as much. That's something that we can experiment with there. And then or ultimately it doesn't really matter too much because you don't tend to see this detail because we're going to be looking at the flying animation from a distance anyway. So a little bit of clipping in this is actually okay for me, but if you were worried about that, you can always just move that around a little bit as well. So then we'll just enter a keyframe for this guy. And I tend to just do that in the 3D view. If you try to do it here in the graph editor, it will bring up another menu. So it's a bit easier if you just do it here. And then for this one, we're going to want to copy that pose. So we can right click and copy and then just paste flipped. And then in this one now, we can insert the keyframe for this. And if we find that we want to change these later, that's not really a problem. We can rotate these out and then just update the keyframe. So just press I, and where it's shading yellow, this is nothing has changed, and where it's orange, it's changed. So as we hit I, you'll see that it changes from orange to yellow. So that gives us like the first little basic part of our animation, and you can see the shell opens up there, and it's looking pretty good. So we're just blocking out basically this kind of start animation, right? So getting this takeoff animation, and we're going to polish and we're going to refine as we go. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to open up the wings. So the first stage of opening up the wings here, and I have also got these plates in here, so we can hide, let me just hide the plates because these aren't relevant for this tutorial as much. So let's just get rid of those. So we're just looking at the wings in here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to unfold the wing so that the wing, we probably want to rotate the wing out, and then as a secondary movement, we'll have it unfold the rest of the wing. So we're looking at this particular area here of the wing. So we want to kind of rotate him out like this. So let's look at that. So at sort of 40 frames, we'll select the wings. I'm going to come over into my rig here, and I'm just going to select all of the wing bones, and we'll just enter keyframes for these. So basically this means that that's like its default state, right? They're not going to change. And then as we move to frame 50, we can then keyframe the movement of this guy outwards. So it's always a good idea to put in a sort of pose before the animation you want to do as it's kind of like resting pose, and then we'll actually animate this guy out. So then the next stage for 60 frames, we're going to come in and we're going to rotate this one out. This can be a little bit tricky to rotate. You can see that just sort of goes a bit crazy. So what I found easier with this one was just to basically enter the rotation for this manually. So I don't know why it does kind of weird stuff there. Maybe also if we just have it locked to the Y rotation, that won't be so bad. I think actually we kind of want to do this though, right? Cool. Okay, and then let's look at that animation now. It's probably going to look a bit weird. That's actually not looking too bad. I thought that might look a bit odd when it was rotating out, but that's looking fine. And then the other thing about these is you can see that they're also bent because we have them conformed to the shape of the body. So to kind of fix that issue, as we get to 50 frames, or as we get to 60, this is where we want the wing to be completely straight. So let's kind of keyframe that and get that actually looking good. So you can see here we straightened out that wing. So that's using these two bones, and we'll just enter a keyframe for that at 60. So you'll see that it will go from nice and bent to basically straightened out like this, which is cool. And then we can do the other one as well. So let's take this guy and we'll just bend him, bend him straight, and then also straight for this guy. So select both of those, keyframe those, and you'll see that now we have that wing stuff. So we want to copy that animation of the wing coming out over to the other wing so that we basically get the same movement on both sides. So to do that, what we can do here is we can just, let's hide some of our bones. So we're just working now with the wings, and I'm just going to select these wings on the left-hand side. And then we can just do the same thing. So copy, and then on the right-hand side here, let's delete these keyframes and we'll just do a paste flipped. And now you can see that we have that animation on both sides. So we've already kind of roughed out our first action, which is this guy of the wings opening. I think I want to make a couple of tweaks just before we move on to our next action and sort of polishing things more. And so the first thing I want to do actually is I want this guy at this frame to basically be rotated to be more in the middle, something like this. That's my current thinking. So I'm going to do that, sort of rotate that up, just enter a keyframe, and then we can just copy this keyframe and we'll just paste flipped. Actually, I think I need to, let's try and do copy and then try and do paste flipped. There we go. Great. So now you can see this is looking pretty good. And the wings also rise up. Because the wings clip a little bit with the shell, I'm actually going to refine the position of the shell as well. So let's hide that and we'll enable the shell as well. So let's go to maybe the end there. So sometimes you'll have this kind of scenario where you need to animate. You'll notice that the bone for the shell is animated at this point at frame 40, but we need to see the animation of it at frame 60 to adjust the shell so that we can adjust the clipping, right? So we can do that. Just adjust it here at frame 60 so we get it into like a pretty good place. We'll keyframe it at frame 60, delete the frame at frame 40, and then just drag it back to frame 40. So now you can see that that's in a good spot basically. And then we're just going to need to copy this guy. So copy, and then we'll paste on the other side as well. So delete this one, paste flipped. Now you can see we've got a pretty good basic animation, which we've roughed out with the action. So that's looking pretty cool already. Great. And then the next step from there is to start bringing this into the overall sequence, which is going to be using the NLA editor. So to do that, we can just split up our NLA editor and we'll go to the nonlinear animation. And so what you'll see is that currently we have this animation class takeoff anim. So this is the action that we've just created, right? Where we have this guy opening up. And so this button here is basically going to push this down in the timeline in the NLA editor. So we can click that and you'll see that now we have that animation in here, right? So there's a couple of cool things you can do with the NLA editor, which make this a useful thing to when you're combining together actions and combining together one big animation. So if we extend this, and we'll just extend it to 300 frames so we've got enough area to play with, you can actually Shift D and duplicate this, and you'll see that we can get the same animation again. So what will happen is that we can have this guy kind of play out, and then this is basically just going to keep playing out. So essentially we'll repeat the animation. The other thing you can also do is you have a few controls here. So you can choose when the animation will start and end. And then these controls here are for blending between different animations, how they add together. You can also play the animation in reverse. So that will play it backwards rather than going forwards. And you can also cycle. If you click this, it's going to essentially, if you have the same animation at the start and the end of the NLA track, it is going to essentially allow you to make a cycle animation. So it kind of is perfectly aligned the next time it kind of plays out, if that makes sense. So that's something that you can also do there. And then you can do other things as well. So you can actually just repeat the animation like a bunch of times. So we could repeat that animation, say 5 times. So this is going to be really useful when we get to doing our wing flight animation, because we only want to just animate it to flap once and then just repeat that a bunch of times. You can also speed up the animation. So if you were to put this at ×5 or 0.5, sorry, that's going to play at twice as fast. So we can actually use this guy to basically control the speed of our animations, which is really nice. But we're going to leave that at playback 1. And so for this, all we want to do actually is just duplicate our animation and then just move it to the last frame and then just enable reverse. So what will happen is when it lands back, it's going to close up, right? So that's the basic first animation. And then what we'll do next is move on to creating the other one. So we're going to create the in-flight animation, and then we'll also create the wing flapping, and then we'll start to blend those together. So that will be the next step. Okay, so now we've got our animation for the taking flight. I want to create the next animations, which is for the wing flapping, and then also for our actual flight itself. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new action, and we're going to call this, let's do that here. So we'll call this animation class wing flap. So we'll do the wing flap first. So this one, we probably only going to want a small amount of frames, maybe like 10 frames or something. So we'll start at maybe frame 60, which is when this one actually ends, and then we'll finish at frame 70. So that should give us a pretty short window just to play out that animation. And so the first thing I want to do, I'm going to turn off everything except the wing. And so at frame 60, this is actually where we want to start with our keyframes, right? Because this is fold out from the previous area. So we probably want to make sure that this is absolutely looking how we want it to. At the moment, there's a bit of a bend in this wing. So I'm just going to jump back over into the takeoff one here. And so what I'm going to do is let's just get rid of our frames again. And I want to just make sure that this guy at frame 60 is rotated to be straight, and we'll just keyframe that. This one I want to just refine a little bit to be more straight, and we'll just update those keyframes. So now that should be looking good. I might need to copy these to the other side potentially. Let's just do that just to make sure that we definitely have got all of those keys how we want those to be. Okay, so copy, and then on the other side, let's just put them here and paste flipped. Okay, great. So now I'm pretty confident that we have a good straight wing that I want in terms of that guy. So we can just save, and I'm just going to cancel that one, and we'll change back our animation frames again back to 60 and 70. And then we're going to select the action here for the animation class, and we're going to do wing flap. So the first thing we want to do is we'll just do it on the left wing, and then we can mirror obviously to the right. So here I want to just insert the keyframes for all of the wings, and then I'm going to create, just to make this nice and easy, I'm going to create this in the middle of here. We're going to bring up the wing, so like rotate it upwards, and we'll just keyframe it. Actually, let me look at this. Yeah, keyframe it here. We can change the animation speed anyway if we need to. And then, yeah, we basically want, I think actually what we want to do is bring this up here, and then I want another keyframe. We'll space these out a bit better in a minute. All the way to the bottom. So that's creating one flap, and then returning to the same point. So it will repeat basically. So you can see that when we play this out, it kind of goes up and down, right? Which is looking pretty good. So that's our basic kind of wing flap animation. We can refine this way more in polish and everything, but I just want to sort of get that basic animation working. So you can just kind of see that. If we want to as well, so these ones, we've got sort of 10 frames. I'm just going to space these out. So that's 3 frames in. Then we have a space between 4. So maybe we should make this maybe 9 frames long so that everything is a bit more even. Maybe something like that. And that will kind of even everything out. Then this would sort of, animation would end at frame 69 rather than frame 70. So you kind of see like something along those kind of lines, right? Okay, and then we also want to select all of our wings on the left-hand side, and we're just going to copy all of our wings, all of our keyframes, copy here, and then we're going to just paste flipped. This will give us an error, which is basically there's no keyframes to paste into. So what you can do here is just press I to keyframe and then paste flipped, and that will now give us that wing flap, right? So you can see we've got our wings flapping, which is pretty cool. The next step for this particular one is just to push this back down in the animation here in the NLA editor. So let's just expand this a little bit. We can have a look at this. And so we're going to want that animation to repeat until it gets to the next frame there. So let's just make this timeline back to, say, 300. And so for this, we're going to push down the animation, and we can create a new track for this as well. So this one we can actually bring Actually, yeah, so let's, so it should select the action here. Let's just do that. It should create a separate track for that when we push that down. So I was just gonna see if I could actually get that to work. It seems to be pushing it down into this track just because it's let's maybe do it. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, we can just push this into another track here below it, and then we can just do this, right? We can just move these between the different tracks. That should be fine. So for this one, we're going to want to call this just wing flap. I'm just going to rename my tracks a bit. And then these are takeoff track. That's fine, just to keep myself a bit organized. And then we'll move this one down as well. And then for here, we're going to repeat this. So we bring the end panel up, and we can just repeat the animation. So you just want to select a value, and then what you'll see as well is that for the wing flap, maybe at 10 frames. Okay, so you can see that there's a weird kind of issue here at the moment where it doesn't seem to be playing out the animation for the wings. So they're starting kind of off here, and then you're not seeing that animation of the wing play out, which is something you can see here. So what we need to do is we need to experiment with the different blending type. Okay, so I figured it out. So essentially what I needed to do here, so you can see now it's blending, is I needed to set the extrapolation from hold. So when it was holding, you'll see that we have this bar, this orange bar, which basically means that it's extending the animation out kind of either side. So if you do hold forward, it's going to hold that animation in place. It's not going to change the animation. So once we get to the flapping area, you'll just see that it kind of stops, right? So if we actually, let's repeat this a little bit less, I can kind of demonstrate my point here. So what happens is the animation plays like as normal, and then it flaps, and then what you'll notice is it kind of just keeps it in place, which is what this is saying. The extrapolation is holding that animation in place forward. And so it was set to hold before and afterwards, which is why you see that the wings are just staying in the place that they are. So if we set this to nothing, then the animation will play of it opening up, and then we'll get our wing flapping, and then everything will close up. So you can see, obviously we don't have any flight yet, but you can see that we've got the basics of our animation. The wing flapping is a little slow, so if we want to increase that speed, we can come in here to the playback speed here and just do that. And then what you'll notice is now the wings will flap at a much faster rate, which is cool. And so one of the other tweaks I would do here in the NLA editor, and to zoom in on this, you just hold control and middle mouse wheel. It's a bit of a confusing control for that. Is I would just overlap this a little bit with the other animations, and then we can just repeat the amount of this until we get to kind of a similar kind of area. So let's just do 45 for that. And then we can actually blend between the animations. So you'll see that we have kind of going straight to flapping, and it doesn't really look very smooth between what happens there. So to kind of blend in and out of those animations, you can select this one, and where we see, if we come over into the options here, we have our blend in and blend out. So we can control this value, and you can choose how many frames it's going to blend in through. So, and then we can do the same kind of here. So we could choose, say, 12 frames to blend out. And then what you'll notice is now that blend will be a lot smoother. So that's something that you can also do just to interpolate between the animations a little bit easier. So now you can see that we have the wing flapping and everything is looking good. Okay, so far now in the class, we've managed to get our takeoff animation figured out and also our wing flapping, and we're getting a pretty good basis for our animation, our flight animation already, which is cool. So the next step now is to make the final part of this, which is the animation or action that we're going to use to actually control the Beetle's flight. Like, where is it going to fly and how is it going to move and translate as it flies? So we're going to turn on the head and the body for those particular areas, and also the legs, I think, for this. Maybe we don't actually need the head for now, just maybe the body. So the first thing we want to do is create another action. We're going to just hit new. This one we're going to do animation class again, and we're going to call this flight. So that's pretty cool. And the first thing we want to do, so we're going to take flight from 60 frames. So if we go to 60 here, and we can limit the animation again. So let's go from 60 frames. And we'll just select, I'm mostly interested in the body for now, because when I move the body around, you can see that I can kind of control the way he flies. And his feet, the IKs are not attached to the body bone. So what I'm most likely going to do here is animate the foot controls. So we'll move the IKs for the feet. We'll animate these guys at the same time as the body. So essentially we can move this guy up. But what's nice about that is we can use this to create some sort of drag from the legs. So it looks like the legs have been affected by gravity, right? So you can sort of see that there. That's a pretty nice like effect. So that's something that we're going to be using our controls to do. So first thing I want to do is just keyframe all of those controls. So we'll keyframe the body and the leg IKs. So we'll just insert a keyframe for those. And that's at just 60 frames at stationary. And then maybe we'll go to around 80 frames. We can always change the timing of this obviously later. But what I want to do next is kind of move the body up and just keyframe the body, so we can get a feeling for like how that's going to look, right? So he kind of just flies up and his legs stay where they are there. And then while he's in flight, let's try and do the return as well. So we'll go to kind of the frame where we expect him to basically land again, which is frame 240. And we'll just copy that keyframe. And I'm going to limit the end of the animation again. And we'll just paste that keyframe in there. So now what's going to happen is he's going to fly up. And then he's going to slowly return back to where he is, because we haven't keyframed him to stay in the position at the top. So we keyframe him to stay in the position at the top again. We can do that by just, I think the difference here is around 20 frames. So I'm going to just do the same thing kind of over here. So we have 240, we'll come back to maybe 220 and just paste those keys. So what you'll see now is he'll kind of fly up. He'll stay in position where he is, and then he's going to land again, right? So that's how it's currently sort of looking. And then what I want to do while he's in the air is I want him to just kind of move around a little bit. I don't want him to just be stationary in one spot. When he's flying around, I want him to just be moving a little. So to do that, that's really easy. You just come in to different points in the timeline, and we'll just try and move him a little bit. So let's move him somewhere over here to begin with, and we'll put in a keyframe for that. So now you'll see that he's going to fly up and kind of move over to the left. And then we'll put another one. I'm just going to get him to do a really basic kind of circular movement. So he just flies around a little bit in a circle. And the reason I want to do that and not change his position too much is because when I come to render him, I basically want him to be sort of in a similar kind of location, like in a similar spot. And we can sort of spread these keyframes out a little bit as well, just to alter the timing. So essentially, I'm just looking at this stage. I just want him to kind of move around a little bit in a circle. And so the first bit you'll notice is he doesn't really move very much. So in the first little part of that, when he's flying, he just moves really slowly, and then he kind of speeds up in where he's kind of moving around. And I quite like maybe something in the middle of both of those in terms of the amount of speed he has. So this stage, we're just looking at the overall speed of his movement and his animation and everything. I'm not worrying about his legs, I'm just worrying about his body. The other thing as well is he's just moving at the moment kind of horizontally. We could definitely get a couple of these keyframes. And you can use these buttons here to basically jump between the different keyframes. So if you want to alter the position of a certain key, I use these guys to just basically jump there. And so we look at the kind of central part of this, and you can see kind of how much he's going to jump between the different areas. So he was originally kind of more centralized, and then when he jumps between these keys, he doesn't move all that much. So for this one, I'm going to pull it out a little bit and then just update the keyframe by pressing I. And then this one, I'm going to move forward a little bit and press I as well to update. And then let's just play out that animation and see kind of how that's feeling. So yeah, he's kind of moving around. I think maybe I want to sort of spread these ones out between keys a little bit more so it's a bit more smooth. Yeah, so that's not bad. Like, that's giving a pretty good kind of, he's flying around in a spot and then he's going to land back. So yeah, so that's given us pretty good basis. And now what I want to do is I want to push my animation down in here. So this is just a block out for now. We're essentially just trying to get everything in place, and then in the next part of the videos here, we'll look at polishing up some of these animations to get something a bit more final. So let's push this down here. That's our animation flight. And so we should see that at the moment, well, the wings are working great even with this set to the hold, because we don't actually animate the wings, right? So you'll see that they're going to play together quite nicely already, which is great. And so now if we want to just preview our whole animation, let's go over to 300 and we'll just bring this back to the start. So now what we can do is we can just click this button here to hide all of the overrides and the displays, and then just basically play out our animation. So if we play that out, you should see that this is gonna fly up. One thing you are noticing though is that in this area, because of the hold, the body now is not rotating up. So what we want to do is actually set this to nothing on both of these. So now you'll see that the body will rotate up, everything will come in, will fly up in the air, and then he'll sort of circle around, and then he'll land again. So that's our animation blocked out. And so now we have something that's looking pretty decent. We can actually start to polish everything. Okay, so now we have our basic animation kind of roughed out. I wanted to show my process for how I actually polished up the animations and add a little bit more personality to everything and pull this together more. So I wanted to show you, so here we have the animation from the class that we just did, which is the takeoff animation. So if I play that out, you'll see that he just basically, all that's happening in that animation, it's really simple, is the body's coming up, the wings are opening, or the shell's opening, the wings are expanding, right? That's basically the animation. And so if I show you the final animation for that, the one that I actually built out for my final project here, you can see hopefully some of the differences that we can see here once it's a bit more polished, right? So what you'll notice here is that firstly, there's some kind of secondary animation and movement. So he's not just completely stationary. He's kind of just moving around. His tendrils are moving. The horn is moving. His body is moving and everything. So he's not completely stationary. And then you'll also notice that before a lot of the body stuff opens up, he also has his legs will kind of move in position as well. So let's just limit this animation again so we can just see it play out. Yeah, so his legs are moving in place. There's a few extra little bits and pieces here. So I was trying to kind of mimic some of the stuff that you can see here in our reference. So essentially, you'll notice that his legs are moving, his body's moving, all the things that I mentioned before when I was showing this reference. I've tried to do some of those kind of concepts and ideas here in terms of the animation, right? So that's like how it kind of ends up looking when it's a bit more polished. So how do we take it to that kind of stage, right? So it's a little bit of repeating the same part of the process as before and a couple of new techniques. So let's kind of jump into that now, and we'll come over to our animation class takeoff here. So that's this guy, and you can see that he's opening up. Also, just before I go any further, I'm just going to make sure that I have my so the animation class flight here. I want to just make sure that I lock these just in case as well. So we have animation class and the wing flap as well. Let's just lock those just in case it removes them. It shouldn't do because they're referenced here, but I just want to make sure. So okay, cool. So that's all looking pretty good. So what I want to do here is I'm going to select the animation class takeoff. So this is our animation. So a couple of things we can do here to improve this. The first thing I did obviously was I animate some of the other secondary areas like the him kind of moving in general. I also move the horn that we have kind of in here, and we have the tendrils kind of move as well. And then the other thing I do is I move the leg position, so it makes it look like he's actually moving his feet as well. So to do all of that, there's basically two techniques I would use to do that. The first one is what we've already covered, which is basically just keyframing manually. So the first thing we can do, say for legs, is that's the technique I would use for the legs. Is I know at sort of 30 frames is when he kind of rises, his body rises up. So you can sort of see that that's what happens there. So one of the things I'd like to do, similar to the reference, is move the leg, especially the front legs, and kind of extend those out so they feel like he's actually using those to kind of push himself up and push his body up, right? So that's an example of how we might do that. We just move it into place and keyframe it, and you'll see that that's now kind of straightening out the leg. And at that stage as well, you might want to, so you can see his leg kind of there. We could also look at rotating this if we need to, because this can give us a bit more control over the orientation of the foot at this area, but I think it's probably fine for where it is. If we wanted it to kind of come more in this direction, we could also do that. And then we may need to, you can sort of see here that it's not quite aligned, so we probably would want to align that. But let's do this. Let's go back to frame 0 and just keyframe that there. And then as we get to frame 30, we'll rotate this so it aligns the foot and keyframe that. So now what you can see is that it basically moves his leg kind of straight, right? But he's not really picking his leg up. He's just kind of moving it into place. So something that I found really helpful with this is to overemphasize animations by keyframing kind of in the middle of the keyframe. And there is probably a better term for that, like animation term, that would make kind of sense to talk about there. So I believe from the reference YouTube videos that I mentioned in that sort of animation workflows, those are called breakdowns and settles. So basically a breakdown is when you put keys kind of in the middle between two keys to kind of help the animation. And then a settle is once it lands on this key, you can then overextend the keys to basically create a nicer secondary animation afterwards. So to do that, we just kind of pick somewhere in the middle, and then what I'm going to do is just kind of move the leg up a little bit and keyframe it there. So what you'll see is that now he kind of picks his foot up and places it. So you can refine this position as well, like I've exaggerated it maybe a little bit too much, but you'll see he just kind of places it, right? And we just also want to make sure that this is definitely on the ground in the right place. So I'm just going to sort of slightly refine that. So this is the process I followed for kind of animating the individual legs. And with some of them, like the ones on the back, I animated those to basically move quite large distances, right? So that it looks like he's moving his legs kind of individually a little bit more. So you can do that, like just kind of move his legs wherever you want. I just wanted to show that basic process. And at the moment as well, you want to check and play through the animation and check the timing, because you'll notice that that leg animating is feeling really slow. And also his body kind of angling upwards is also feeling quite slow. So this can just be about polishing the placement of the keyframe. So if we move, say, the body rotation, you'll see that that is now kind of snappier, right? And it's going to be the same for these keyframes moving the leg. So if we were to kind of move these keyframes and tighten up that spacing there, you'll see that his leg will now snap into place a lot nicer. So that's something that you can definitely do with the polish part of it, is just getting that refinement of those keys, right? So I do a pass kind of on all of those legs. I won't show, say, every single leg. So maybe do one more leg just to quickly show that. So at, say, 30, let's do at 20 frames, we're going to keep him there. And then maybe at 30 frames, I'm going to look to kind of move him somewhere over here. So let's just keyframe that and just see kind of how that is going to look. So yeah, so that's kind of cool. And you can also bring in like other sort of animation. So instead of like he's moving kind of forwards, let's maybe move this one. You could move him at a different time as well. Like, don't always necessarily put them at the same time. So what you'll see is that now these kind of legs all move at different, they're like slightly offset from each other, which can definitely help to make it feel more natural, because he's not necessarily going to move all of his legs together. So you can kind of see that that kind of offset creates that really interesting sort of animation and movement, right? So that's something that you can definitely do, and we can obviously polish these out more and change the timings and everything. But that's kind of one thing I wanted to show. The next thing is actually using the curve editor. So to add sort of secondary movement to something, something you can do in Blender, which is really nice, is add modifiers to your animation. So I want to show that process. So what we'll do, we'll change this over now to the graph editor. And so if we look at the body, we have some keyframes and things in here on the body. You can see we have X location, Y location. And as we zoom in on this, so we can just sort of like frame up our keyframes here, and you can see these are the curve points of those animations. You can select these individual Bezier points and tweak them, so you can change like the interpolation of the way that these are actually working and everything. So that's how you would control more specifically your actual keyframes within the curve editor. But one thing you can do is, so at the moment, the X location of this, there's no real location change here. It's mostly a rotation. There's a little bit of location, but it's not really moving a whole lot. It's mostly rotating, right? And so one things we can do here is we can come over to our modifiers, and we have modifiers, different modifiers you can choose from. And so the noise modifier is a really nice way to add kind of extra movement on that bone. So you'll see that this is now kind of jumping up and down all around. It's very fast, and obviously it's almost looks like it's kind of vibrating, right? It's a bit of an odd look at the moment, but this is a non-destructive, so you can change all of these parameters, and it's going to be adding on top of the animation, right? So you can choose the way that it blends, like you do with the NLA editor. You can choose like the blend mode type, and then we can tweak, say the scale is going to control the size and how frequently this graph is going to be changing. So you can see if we change the scale, we have a lot more of a slower kind of movement, right? So we can come back to more frequent. And then strength is the intensity of how much it's actually moving that X value. So you can see that as we change the scale, it's jumping up and down like a lot more. So this is almost now, if we were to change the scale and have these nice big smooth kind of curves, it almost looks like he's really moving up and down quite a lot, right? So you can just control the strength of that and add some sort of secondary movement. And then the offset will just move the noise, obviously. We can use the phase. I don't really tend to play too much with the phase. But yeah, the offset is pretty good for just kind of varying up. If you've got lots of noises, you want to change that, or change the phase will change that as well. And then one of the other things we can do is we can restrict the frame. So if we wanted that noise to just be starting and go from frame 0 to 60, then we could do that, right? So we can just have it only affect this animation, and then it just flattens out kind of everywhere else. And we can also have it in the same way we do with our other animations, is kind of blend out, right? So if we were to add in keyframes, we can have this kind of slowly come in as an effect on top. So that's pretty handy as well for restricting the frames and everything. So once we've got a keyframe like this as well, we can press this button to copy it, and we can paste it onto the other one. So we could paste it onto a Z and Y, and now you can see that this is moving in multiple axes, and we can just change like the offset of that on some of these, so they're just slightly different from each other. And you'll see that now we have a little bit of secondary motion on his body, so as he moves around. And that also, because of the IKs, you can also see that impacts his legs as well, like his legs are slightly moving from the position. So we're getting something that's looking a little bit more refined when we add those non-destructive results. And you can do that on any of these. So we can do this also on the rotation. So one of the things I did here was, we can just pause this temporarily, is I made for the tendrils, I made a noise that would basically, so we just keyframe these. You have to add keyframes. If there's no keyframe attached to the bone for the tendril, then you would just need to come in and select these guys and basically just insert a keyframe for those. And then from here, we can now access our X, Y, and Z, and we can add, say, a noise. For this one, I actually added, I think it was, so yeah, in the Y direction, because the local Y direction is pointing up. So we choose a noise in Y, and you can see that we can actually get this tendril to kind of move up and down. And so we probably wouldn't want kind of that sort of crazy strength, but what I tend to find is maybe like a value of 15 for scale is pretty good, and then you can sort of change the strength of that, maybe go for something like 0.5. And now if we turn off the bones, you'll kind of notice that his tendril's just moving up and down a little bit. And so once you've kind of got that in place, you can then copy that to the other bones. So like here we can just select this guy and maybe come into our Y location and paste that. Again, Y location and paste. And then I would just change the offset. So just basically put a random value into the offsets here. And now you'll see that those tendrils are kind of moving, but they're not moving the same. Everything is like slightly offset from each other there. So that helps with the tendrils. And then you can just repeat that process here. So if I go to these guys, we can come in and select the Y rotation. And I think if you control click these and alt paste them, you'll get that appearing on each of these. I think I've actually just put that onto the rotation rather than the location, but yeah, so let's put it Y location, and paste. And now you'll see that we have the modifier on each of these. So you just come in and just basically change up the offset a bit. Okay, and then now you can see that these guys are just kind of moving around a little bit, which is pretty cool. So yeah, so that's in terms of polish, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover really, is that essentially what I did in each of these animations was I came through and did a pass on all of the bones and looked at my reference and tried to polish things up. So if we look at the more final animation that I created again, and we just look at the wings open, you can see that when all of this kind of comes together, you've got the legs moving, you've got the individual things rotating. For the horn, I also did, so for the tendrils, the body, and the horn, I used the noise modifiers as I showed here with that process. And then I hand keyframed the legs, how I wanted those to be. And then the body and the back and everything is the same. I think for the shell, actually, you can see there's a little bit of a noise to the shell as that kind of moves around. So for the shell bone, I did that too. And you can just see how that animation plays out. And now let's just look at, just kind of come back in here. So if you start in the middle of the animation like this, or stop in the middle of the animation and everything is in the wrong place, you can just go back to frame 0 and just reset everything. So the other ones I wanted to show was the, so for the wings flapping, I wanted to just show this one as well. Okay, so yeah, so for wings flapping, this is what I did for the final wing flap animation. So a couple of things I did here is to really exaggerate the movement is when it gets to the kind of top of the animation, I bend the bone, because that's what you'll see if you look at the references, that the wings have a flex to them. So basically, as we get to kind of the bottom of the animation, we flex them kind of down, and as we get to the top, we flex them upwards in a curve, basically. And then the other thing I also noticed when I was looking at some of that sort of more slow motion footage of them flying is that the shell also, you can see that you get that nice flex, which is what I was talking about. And then you also see that the shell is moving by the vibration of the wing. So you can see that it kind of is jumping up and down. And in some of the other videos I showed, I had that issue. You can see that like in kind of full res speed. So I can just quickly get that as well. Yeah, so here you can see that you've got this kind of look where those actual shell pieces, they look like they're kind of vibrating almost, right? Like everything is moving very quickly. So Yeah, so seeing that in slow motion definitely helps to work out how to animate it. But essentially, as this guy comes up, the shell comes up. As this comes down, the shell comes down, and that just creates that sort of vibration basically from the movement of the wing. So that's what I did to kind of polish up that one. And then for the final animation, let me just go over to the right keyframes here. And so for the flight body animation, this kind of flies up in the air. And then one of the things that I did, it doesn't have too much movement in there. I've got the same kind of noise modifiers for the tendrils and for the horn kind of moving around. And then what I tended to do here with the with these guys, with the legs, is I basically just keyframed the position of the IKs. So when he kind of comes up, they kind of start pretty low, and then you see you get this kind of as they rise up by the air current or whatever, and then as he sort of floats around, then when he goes to go back down, his legs kind of rise up as if they're being affected by the drag of the wind as they're kind of coming back down again. And so for that stuff, also, I mean, at the moment these legs are fairly high up, which is more like a stylistic choice for the animation. If you wanted those to be, say, more affected by gravity, then what you could do is basically just keyframe these to come down a little bit more. So as we, and if we could just auto key this so that we don't have to manually key them in. So yeah, you basically would just select these. And then if I make sure I've got my gizmo enabled, so we'll just come in and select our IKs for the legs, we would just move these down, right? So now when he kind of flies up, his legs, actually we've kind of, I don't know what we've done there, but we've ended up rising them up into the air really high. I think this is one of the other reasons why I tried to stay away from the auto key, because it just sometimes it can create weird issues. So let's try again and see if that can just fix our issue. Yeah, okay. So basically now they're more affected by gravity, right? So when you kind of move them back down again, and so you need to kind of come in, like I've obviously got a lot of keys for these individual feet to kind of move the feet where I want them to ideally kind of locate. But you can basically use these guys to jump through the frames, kind of move them down a little bit. Just keep going through, adjusting, so we can have maybe it impacted more by gravity, right? So, yeah, so something like that. And we just keep going through and adjusting. I think those are already pretty low down. So this is now, it feels more like they're not being adjusted. The wings aren't coming up by air currents quite as much. So this is just like a choice artistically of where I want these guys to actually be kind of located. I want this one to be up a little bit more actually, so we'll just adjust that. But yeah, so you can see that now just by doing that, basically when he kind of comes and flies up, his legs are now kind of hanging from the body a little bit more. That's really easy to adjust, is basically what I wanted to show. So yeah, as far as polish is concerned for this guy, this one is really straightforward because he doesn't really, he kind of just moves around a little bit, and then it's his legs that are providing a lot of the movement, and then I'm using the noise modifiers again. So yeah, hopefully that kind of showcases like the workflow for the polish. So in summary, the things I would tend to do is try to look at the references that I was actually trying to match. So if I'm looking at these kind of things, like observe what's in the reference and try to match it as far as the keyframes and animation is concerned. So stuff like when we were looking at, say, the animations, if we kind of come back here, when we're looking at the animation for so this is another thing as well, is if you have auto key turned on and you try to reset, it's going to create a new action for you. So another thing to just remember there. But the animation for the wings opening up is a good example of how we do the polish here. So yeah, so you see here that I obviously added all this secondary animation for the legs to be moving. And then we add the noise modifiers as well. And the noise modifiers are definitely going to help us a lot with that kind of extra level of realism and movement in there. You can just see that him just moving around a little bit. He's not stationary. And you can, because those are non-destructive, you can apply those and tweak those later. So if I don't want him to be jumping up and down quite as much as he is now, it's just a case of going over to that body bone. So we can just select our body bone and see the modifier that we have here on the different locations and rotations, and we can choose to change the scale of these. And usually you can also globally adjust the scale of stuff, which is pretty good. That seems to have somehow broken it, which is cool. But yeah, so depending on the scale of these, like some of these actually, oh, okay, this one has like a really low scale. You can see that the rotation ones are 0.05, whereas these guys are 0.5, sorry. So we could, you know, globally adjust the intensities of these and see that it has a very different visual. If we wanted to do that, we can have him definitely not move around quite as much and be a little bit more stationary. The other thing we could also have done in this little stage is maybe have got him to walk forward a little bit, so his body would move a little bit forward and then his legs would move. But I just didn't want it to be too complicated in the animation. I wanted it to be like a pretty simple, it just kind of gets ready for flight, flies up and then lands again. So yeah, it's a nice kind of easy animation to do, a little bit less complex, but that's kind of where I would go as far as polish is concerned. Okay, so next I wanted to show how we would actually start to render out our animation as far as getting something more finalized is concerned. So the first thing here, so we've got our NLA tracks, we've done our animation here. Let's say we've also polished this to be more of a finalized animation, and we want to actually save this out for a as an actual image or an actual video or an set of images, right? So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to need to get a camera in the scene. So you can just press Control A and add the camera in. So we'll just come over here and choose camera. And then to view that camera, we can press 0 on the keyboard. And then to position it, if we go to view, you want to make sure you have camera to view. And then you can start to actually position this. So we're going to want to set the scene, the resolution of this. So you can choose like what sort of aspect ratio you want to create with this. And so what I'm trying to do here is I want to choose in the camera itself, I want to choose like the focal length of the camera. And then I would choose like kind of how zoomed in I am on the image. So like if I wanted to say set like 100mm lens, as if I'm sort of quite zoomed in on this. And then I would position my camera and just try to look at whereabouts this camera is going to be so that when the animation plays out, the beetle isn't going to clip out of the actual scene, right? You can see that there. So at the moment, this camera feels like maybe it's a little bit tall. So we can adjust maybe the width of this and then kind of zoom in a little bit more. So you just want to play out the animation, check that the beetle is going to be in the frame. And then as we move the camera and everything, as he moves around, he's not going to clip outside of the frame. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to just adjust these guys to a bit more round whole numbers. And so once we're happy with that, we can turn camera to view off, and now we can move this around and we can zoom this in without affecting the position of the camera. So we can check that we're happy with everything, turn off this guy and make sure that this is actually what we want to capture. We can make more adjustments to this if we want to as well. So as far as capturing it is concerned, all you do is you're going to choose which type of renderer you want to use. So for the sake of speed, we'll use the Eevee renderer, which is the real-time renderer. So if you click this guy here, we can see this is what the beetle looks like in the Eevee renderer. Next week, we're going to work on presentation. So I'm mostly just interested in looking at the animation and making sure I'm happy with all the timings and everything of the animation. And that when I render it out, especially when I get to polish and things like that, I want to make sure that everything is looking how I want it to look. So doing test renders is a good way to do that. Eevee is really quick for doing that. If you render, so if I rendered a frame in Eevee, it's likely to take, I think on my computer, it takes maybe a second to render one frame. So if you were doing 300 frames, it would be 300 seconds to render out the whole clip, right? And that's a 10-second clip. So that's how long it would take to render. Whereas if I go to Cycles, Cycles is ray traced renderer, and when I use the Cycles renderer, it takes maybe 20 seconds to render a frame. So you can see that it takes a lot longer. When I did my final presentations, I did render them in Cycles, but you just have to wait. So all for previewing though, I would render in Eevee. And the other thing which can help you is really lowering the resolution of that. So if you're going to render out your clip, make a small video that's only 200 by 300 pixels, and that's enough to kind of test with. So I'll go through kind of how I do that. So the next step is basically in your output. If you come over to where it says output here, usually if you just do a render, so if we just rendered out the image here in Eevee, this is just going to render it in PNG format, right? So when we get our render done, we look at the compositor as well, make sure that that's actually rendering the right scene. So yeah, you can see here that that's like rendering out everything. So if I go to my kind of end, this is like what it's rendering out in terms of Eevee, right? So you can sort of see that there. One thing I've also noticed is it's also, at the moment, it's rendering a bunch of the rig shapes. So if you have that, you can just turn off the rendering of these particular collections. So just make sure you have things you don't want to render, basically just turn those off in the renderer. And so then when I do a render, it's just going to render out an image, and you'll see this is kind of the image that we get. We've also got some of these collections as well, so let's just turn those off as well. And so basically you just want to make sure that when you do your render, you don't have a bunch of things in the scene rendering that you don't want rendering, right? So you sort of see how that's looking there. And then if I go back over into my modeling tab here, I think I was actually in animation, so go back over to animation. And so now if I want to render out an image or a video, I can choose to set the file format. So you can render out frame by frame as PNG and then composite it together. For the sake of testing, I like to just choose the MPEG video. And then over in here, you can choose in encoding, you can set your encoding to an MP4 file. So now we can render out an MP4. The downside to rendering a movie is that if it crashes, Blender crashes, while rendering the sequence, your video will only be as many frames as it manages to render. Whereas with PNG, you can then start it from the frame that it crashed at, so you can then continue to render. So it's a little bit safer to render with PNG, but to be honest, I was rendering mostly to video, and I don't think I had a crash when I did that. So it was going pretty well for me. So once you've done that, you set that up, all you would do is then you come to render animation. So we'll just do that, and you can sort of see the process of what it's going to do. It's essentially going to render out the frames, and it's going to render frame by frame. You can see it's playing out the animation, and we can actually see how this is looking. And then when it's got to the end, we'll have a video. So I will just pause this until it gets to frame 300, and then I'll show that. Okay, so now that video is finished rendering, you can see that we have our media open here. And so if we play this out, you'll see that it's just going to take off and fly around, and you can see the wings are flapping and everything here, and then it's going to land back and the shell's all going to close up. So you can actually see that how this animation is starting to look in terms of the frames. It does seem to not be, what's interesting is it does seem to not be playing the shell opening up there for some reason. Oh no, it is. I don't know. There's something with Windows Media Player here where it's just not previewing that for some reason. But yeah, you can see that this is more than good enough for us to actually test and see how our animation is looking as far as like a final output is concerned. And then in the next part of the class, we are going to obviously work on rendering. So I can show the process for how I kind of rendered those out to look really nice. And one of the other things you can do, so at the moment, we're obviously just rendering out our video, and the resolution of that is 200 by 300 pixels, or close to 300 by 400, right? So when we render the final video, we would then up this resolution. So I think for the videos I was working maybe at like a 1080p kind of resolution for the videos. I think I rendered them out at maybe, so if we increase this one to kind of 1920, and then yeah, whatever the ratio for this one would be at the X value. So that's basically what I did. I just increased the resolution, and then when I rendered them finally, instead of using Eevee, I used Cycles, which gave a nicer visual. So that's essentially how I went through that process of actually rendering out the videos. But I wanted to cover in this video specifically about just how you actually test your work. So as you've made an animation, it's a great idea to render it out, but render it out at a low resolution so that you can test it and check that the video is looking how you want it to look, and you can see that when it plays out, this is how it looks. And if you're happy with the camera position and you're happy with how it's working, and if you want to tweak anything. So especially once you get to polish, this is really valuable because it doesn't take very long to render, and it's a good idea to do that before you do the final render and commit to it rendering for a long time. So I think when I was rendering the final video in Cycles with all the lighting and everything, it was taking maybe an hour and a half to render the video. So I don't want to waste an hour and a half. If there's something wrong, I can see it in the little preview that I render, which only takes me a few minutes to render. So it's a good little test you can do and check everything before you go to do your final render. Hey everyone, so I just wanted to run through a recap of what we covered in the videos this week, and then we're going to set the homework assignment for this week. So in this week, we went through a recap of where we were as far as like rigging the robot is concerned, getting those bones and everything, the skeleton, set up correctly, and having the control that we need to actually be able to edit and hide bones and be able to tweak and animate the actual beetle that we've created here. And then from there, I showed a couple of references and how I thought about the animation, how I approached them, like how did I come up with the ideas, and what references did I use. And then from there, I showed the basics of using the different animation editor windows. So we've got our action editor and our NLA editor and the graph editor and everything. And I showed how to build out basic poses, which we will start to use a little bit more in the upcoming weeks for our presentation. And then from there, I just blocked out a animation for flying, and this is broken into different actions. The first one is the taking flight, and then we have our wing flapping animation, and then we actually control the flight path of the beetle as well. And then we use the NLA editor to combine that all together, and then reverse the animation at the end, repeat the animation of the flapping and change the speed, and blend between these so we can actually create our final block out. Once we've got that all blocked out, which is sort of roughly where we are kind of now, I've done a little bit of polish here to that initial sort of flight takeoff animation. But then we would look at polishing everything. So a couple of the ways that I did that was to hand key and refine a lot of the poses and blend between different animation states. And then I would also add modifiers like the noise modifier to add secondary animation to different parts or different bones so that we get a little bit of extra movement. So that's how I'm polishing up the animation. And then I showed the process of actually testing the renders by rendering out a small preview of the animation that I can actually judge how the animation is looking. So as far as the homework is concerned, what I would expect from this week is that you work on an animation for flight. If you don't want to do flight, that's absolutely fine. You can also animate another type of animation if you want to, but just take the lessons from the different modifiers, like how we actually, the different windows, the action editor and the NLA, and combine together your animations. And you want to start by looking at reference and then figuring out how you're going to combine together your animations, get those blocked out within the action editor, then combine them together using NLA. And then the expectation for finalizing the homework this week is just you would then go into each one of these and polish them until you got to a place where you were pretty happy as far as the animation is concerned. And then do some test renders. So for deliverables, a test render of the animation would be great. You can render at a slightly higher resolution if you want to have something that's a bit more presentable for the class. But yeah, we'd be mostly looking at the animation there. If you want to show it just in the viewport as well, if you just want to screen capture the animation here in the viewport, that's also fine. You don't have to render it out necessarily. Just show how you've animated things, show your keyframes and things like that. And we can look at the way that that's animating there as well for this week.